you
Well,
know?
look, you cannot, I mean, if I can jump into this suicide murder theory, you really can't hold on to a theory like that without some shred of evidence that one of these two was unstable. That one important chain, again, to my hypoxia theory, that the pilots were overcome with hypoxia, is that the pilot oxygen canisters, which are large and can give them oxygen, emergency oxygen for 2 hours, were serviced. First of all, who's talking on the radio tells you one thing. This is fact. Who's talking on the radio tells you who's flying the plane. Whoever's talking on the radio is not flying the plane. That's the job of the pilot not flying. They were taken off the airplane and repressurized and reinstalled on the airplane. Does not happen every time. He's heading back to Kuala Lumpur, but then veers away from that and heads to another airport, Langkawi, which to me is a pink flag again because Langkawi is where this young man learned to fly. During the entire short flight, we know that the Captain Zahari was flying because First Officer Farik was on the radio. The last call, who's talking? Captain Zahari's talking. So that means First Officer Farik is flying the airplane. So the plane handed off. Yes, we know that the rat deployed because it would have deployed under the circumstances of the plane running out of fuel. The reason I think he was not in the cockpit, I'll jump ahead, is because
Sure.
if anything happened, like what I think happened, which was the decompression of the aircraft, I think that Captain Zahari, with his amount of experience, 18,000 hours of flight time, he would have probably reacted correctly. That there was a decompression, but that decompression could not have been so grave as to make the airplane not fly with integrity because it did. And that's a fact. It flew for its entire fuel load. We know that for the amount of time the airplane flew, and we know that the rat deployed before the airplane went down. That's the ram air turbines.
Morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience from around the globe. This is your host, Sid, and welcome back to another episode of the Sit Down with Sid podcast, where we bring people together one conversation at a time. A quick note before we begin. MH370 remains a complex mystery with many conflicting theories. The views expressed by our guests are their own. Our goal is to provide a platform for various perspectives as we continue to piece together the story. Joining us today is Christine Negroni, a world renowned aviation journalist, investigator, and author of The Crash Detectives. A former ABC News correspondent and lead investigator for major aviation litigation, Christine has spent decades uncovering the unbroken chain of the events behind global disasters. She is a unique voice in the field, balancing technical, mechanical analysis with the human factor. From high altitude chamber research to deep dives into maintenance logs, she offers a compelling, science based perspective on the physiological and mechanical vulnerabilities that can turn a routine flight into mystery. Christine, as we continue this series and search for answers, your investigative clarity is more vital than ever. It is a profound honor to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be with you today. I'm very glad that you are exploring this air accident from the range of perspectives. So, the more people who chime in, most of the time, the more good information you get. Sometimes there's some nonsense, but whatever, that's life. But I appreciate your desire to have me talk about my theory about what happened to Malaysia 370.
Thank you so much, Christine. And off the record, as I was saying, that we have gotten so much love and support from the MH370 community. So
Good.
you being here today adds another important layer to this series. Now, To start us off, could you share a bit about your background as an aviation journalist and the specific moment that drew you into the deep investigative dive that became the Crash Detectives?
Okay, sure. So, The Crash Detectives is my second book. My first book is called Deadly Departure, and it is about what was at the time the mysterious crash of TWA Flight 800 in 1996. This was a 747 that was taking off from New York JFK. 13 minutes into the air, it exploded and fell into the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 230 people aboard. At the time, I was a correspondent for CNN and really didn't know much more about aviation other than I flew a lot because I'd been working in television news and network news for quite some time. But I did, in the process of covering that disaster, which was a 4 year exploration, learned a lot about actually how accident investigations are handled. And I was hired by, after the book came out, I was hired by an aviation law firm to do their investigations. And so I went from being a journalist to being an investigator with on the job training for the New York law firm that employed me. So for 8 years, I learned how to be an air crash investigator. I joined the International Society of Air Safety Investigators. And during that time, I was asked by the FAA to sit on a rulemaking advisory committee that was overseeing the rules that govern how aircraft wiring is maintained, repaired, installed, designed, manufactured, and how people who deal with aircraft are trained, maintained, blah, blah, blah. So it was a very multifaceted work that we did for 5 years. And at the end, there were a number of rules that we proposed should go into effect that would make the electrical system on aircraft more robust and the people who design, maintain, blah, 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 work on it and were educated on it. And so I mention all of this because I want to make it clear that I come from many different perspectives over the years, first as a journalist and investigator, then specifically as an investigator into aircraft accidents, and then to subcategorize that for a minute, not just investigating aircraft accidents, but doing it without access to the investigator's official records until they become public information. So that's a niche kind of investigation. It's quite like some of the other guests you've had on the show. They're not official. They have to make all their theories and calculations based on what's available in the public realm. So that's in itself, we could talk for hours about that, but just to put that aside. And then I spent 5 years within the FAA learning about how the sausage gets made, really. Like, how do these rules come about? How do we figure out what is the threat and what is the risk and what is the benefit and what is the ways that you can change it without spiraling into a whole other set of unintended consequences. So, okay, now I will move quickly. After that, I was asked, after I left the law firm, I was asked by many organizations. You said I was a correspondent for ABC. I was not. I was hired by ABC, and I am oftentimes hired by NBC or the New York Times to go in and be their expert, not in telling what happened, but in finding the people and helping them with their coverage, helping them ask the right questions, analyze the answers. I'm the sort of the person who speaks both languages, the languages of the
Mhm.
investigation and the language of the public, to make these things understandable to the public. And it was during that experience with ABC at Malaysia 370 that I spent 6 weeks there on the ground. I worked on the investigation for them. And then I wrote my second book, The Crash Detectives, because during the time I was in Malaysia, I started to believe I knew what happened to that airplane. And that more and more evidence began to support my theory. And I wrote the book, The Crash Detectives. And that's who I am.
Wow, what an impressive background and such a vast experience you have. So let me go back to MS370. You said you were there
Okay.
for the first 6 weeks. Now, in you mentioned in your work that every accident is an unbroken chain of small events. Now, in the case of MH370, what do you believe was the very first link in that chain before the plane even reached the cruising altitude?
Well, that unbroken chain of events can go back years and years. I mean, during the course of my investigation, I had an opportunity to speak to a gentleman who had worked in a maintenance facility outside of Malaysia where they were working on the fuselage connection points. And at that time, the way they're put together, and it's going to sound very simplistic, it's obviously more sophisticated than this, but when you are working in your kitchen and you want to caulk the tile to the countertop, you will, make a seam of caulk and that, helps keep it waterproof, blah, blah, blah. So the same sort of procedure works as these two as pieces of the cylinders of the fuselage get put together. And when they are repaired or whatever, or need access, that caulk is removed. Now that's a very delicate process. And this is just what I was told. I've never actually seen it happen. But the fellow who was working on these for Malaysia said that you have to be very careful. The scribe, that is the tool that removes the caulk, has to be made of a certain material that will not scratch the aluminum. But in the process of removing this, it takes a lot longer if you're using plastic versus if you're using aluminum.
Of course.
And in the process, some mechanics were using aluminum tools. We're using a razor-like tool to remove that caulk because you can get it done a lot faster. And that he cited to management or someone, I don't remember about my notes in front of me, he cited this could be a contributor because if you are actually um, weakening the connection of the aluminum, you're
Mhm.
creating a potential break point. So when you say what's the first chain of events, we don't know what the first chain of events is, but it could go back as far back as the last time that airplane had a D-check or had a repair in which something had to be done that would change the hull integrity. I'm not saying it did. I'm not saying this airplane was involved. I'm just saying that that really is how far you have to go back to understand what might have happened, especially without the physical evidence that can shortcut your path. All right. If you see, something that's clearly amiss in the wreckage, you can then focus in on that. But we don't have that. I assume, it's my theory, that there was a massive decompression on this airplane, but not the kind of depression, the decompression that would have compromised the airworthiness of the airplane. That's a seesaw, right? We know there was a decompression. Excuse me. My theory posits that there was a decompression, but that decompression could not have been so grave as to make the airplane not fly with integrity because it did. And that's a fact. It flew for its entire fuel load. We know that for the amount of time the airplane flew, and we know that the rat deployed before the airplane went down. That's the ram air turbine saying, I got no more fuel in the tank. I'm going to spin and try and keep this airplane aloft as long as I can. So we
Hmm.
know that it flew like a perfect 777. We knew it flew like that. That's a good fact. We put that in our pocket when we look at other theories. Did I go off point?
No,
Oh,
no,
going
no.
to chain of events. So those are the things we look at. Now, one of the to go close to the day of the accident, I would say that one important chain, again, to my hypoxia theory, that the pilots were overcome with hypoxia, is that the pilot oxygen canisters, which are large and can give them oxygen, emergency oxygen for 2 hours, were serviced. It might be more than 2 hours. Check me on that, but for quite an amount of time. They were taken off the airplane and repressurized and reinstalled on the airplane. That does not happen every time. Sometimes they're just refueled in situ. But in this case, they were taken off the airplane and then brought back and reinstalled. This creates a potential reinstallation problem. And I also learned, and this is a fact from pilots I've spoken to, that when they test the mask, which they do every time they get in the airplane, they test their passenger oxygen mask. They hit a little button, and that button will put oxygen to the mask, and they say, "Oh, okay, it's working." If they put test for 10 seconds or whatever, and they put the mask back. But that is an incorrect way to test the mask. Because if you get 10 seconds of oxygen, it could have been oxygen in the hose. It may not be feeding from the tank. So this is a mechanism whereby it might not have been reinstalled. The pilots might not have detected it because of a common way of testing the masks. And then when they took off and actually needed those oxygen containers in a decompression event, they weren't getting it. So
Wow.
that's the chain. There's lots of links in between, but those are the two examples I would give of the far away link and the very close link.
Three things that stood out to me from your conversation. We have had so many guests. The caulking around the fuselage, number one. Number second, you said that the rack was deployed, which has never been mentioned by any of our guests, or to my personal knowledge, that it was deployed before entering this
Absolutely.
ocean, crashing.
Oh, that's known fact.
And the third part you said was, and this is why I want to bring this up, is I know the central pillar of your theory is the palace oxygen system, and you mentioned that they were serviced and reinstalled just before this flight. Now,
Right.
from the investigating point of view, you being an investigator, why is that such a massive red flag in your eyes as an investigator?
Why is what? Why is what such a massive red flag?
The tanks being serviced and reinstalled just before the flight, is that a normal procedure? As you said, it happens, but is that a normal procedure or is that a red flag? Then why, first of all, to begin with, these oxygen systems were serviced and reinstalled specifically before that flight?
Yes, there for two reasons. One is because no, that is the way they are serviced, but they are
Sure.
not always serviced in that way. In other words, you don't have to
Got it.
do that. So
Got it.
what triggered the mechanics to say in this particular circumstance, let's take them in to the facility and redo them? Were there previous events in which pilots were reporting that the oxygen masks weren't working, or was there something reported to put the mechanics eye on servicing them at this time? They were not in need of servicing. In other words, they didn't need refilling for this flight. So they still had plenty, and this is in the report, they still had plenty of pressurized oxygen in the tanks. But for some reason, they did
Mhm.
this. It says perhaps there was some sort of a maintenance record on these tanks. Perhaps the pilots of previous flights had reported something. We don't know why they were reserviced, but they were. And then the second thing, which of course, whenever you get your car back from the mechanic, not whenever, but oftentimes you get your car back from the mechanic and something has been left open. The oil tank, cap is sitting in the hood of your car, whatever. Once a plane comes out of service, it is obviously supposed to be fixed 100%, but people are people and mistakes happen. And that's why the fact that it was just out of service and it was serviced for a reason we don't understand, and it was a somewhat unusual time to be servicing those oxygen tanks makes it something you'd look at. Is it a red flag? No, it's a pink flag or it's a flag. It's a flag. I don't
Mhm.
want to give it a color. It's a flag.
Okay. No, no, good to know. I mean, this conversation is already so intriguing in the early stages because, as I said, we have had so many guests, and there are some things that you're mentioning which are new to our ears, as a host hosting this series. I want to talk about the radio transmission. You have noted that the final radio transmission was made by First Officer Farid Abdus Hamid. Based on the standard cockpit culture, what does this tell us about Captain Zahari, where he might have been, and why his potential absence so critical to the emergency that followed the whole narrative?
Sure, sure. And that's a good question because it's the sort of thing that it's another flag for us that we can't know, but you can look at the range of pilot behavior over, thousands and thousands of flights and thousands of pilot experiences and make a few guesses. First of all, who's talking on the radio tells you one thing. This is fact. Who's talking on the radio tells you who's flying the plane. Whoever's talking on the radio is not flying the plane. That's the job of the pilot not flying. So during the entire short flight, we know that the Captain Zahari was flying because First Officer Farik was on the radio. The last call, who's talking? Captain Zahari's talking. So that means First Officer Farik is flying the airplane. So the plane handed off. This is totally in keeping with what we know about these pilots. That is, that Farik was on his last flight before becoming a qualified first officer on the 777. And that Zahari, who was well known in the pilot community for being the aviation geek of all aviation geeks, and probably quite proud of the fact that he was bringing this young pilot into his next step in his career, was lost my train of thought when I got there with Farik, but that he was now handing over control of the airplane.
Hmm.
Once Farik was flying the airplane, they were in cruise flight. He was being handed off to the next air traffic control zone. What would Zahari, a man in his 50s who was a smoker and a coffee drinker and on an overnight flight, what might he want to do? I think he wants to go to the bathroom. I have experience with men of that age, and they go to the bathroom more often. So I think that he probably had a big cup of coffee before he got on that plane. They did their workup, blah, blah, blah. They're 2.5 hours later. He probably handed it over to Farik and said, I'm going to go use the bathroom. I'll be right back. Maybe he wanted another cup of coffee. Who knows? But he left the cockpit. And that is not known to me, but I think a possible link in the chain. It's likely that that was the case. And the reason I think he was not in the cockpit, I'll jump ahead, is because
Sure.
if anything happened, like what I think happened, which was the decompression of the aircraft, I think that Captain Zahari, with his amount of experience, 18,000 hours of flight time, he would have probably reacted correctly. But Farik, not so much. He's young. He's probably an ace pilot for all I know, but he doesn't have the years of experience. And I can tell you, as a woman in my 60s, I know more than a woman in her 30s. I have more experiences. And so did Captain Zahari.
Wow. We had Captain Nick Puslan on the show, the
Yes, I
chief
know
pilot,
him. I met him.
and he speaks highly about Captain Zahari. He actually put him in the top 1% when it comes to his professionalism. And so it's. I mean, as you said, you mentioned 18,000 hours. Maybe he had to use the bathroom. So once again, these are all links. Nothing has been proven
Correct.
uh, or published by the Ministry of Transport in Malaysia as such, to my knowledge. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it's good to know that people like yourself and everyone else is still trying to do their best to actually come to some sort of conclusion that like what actually happened with this plane,
Right.
you
Well,
know?
look, you cannot, I mean, if I can jump into this suicide murder theory, you really can't hold on to a theory like that without some shred of evidence that one of these two was unstable. And when you talk to people who actually knew him, when you look at his record, the man was, as I said, an aviation geek more than any other. I mean, he had more hours, commercial flight hours, than Captain Sullenberger. And he was younger than Captain Sullenberger. He's the pilot of the Miracle on the Hudson flight.
Yes.
So you're talking about somebody who has loads of experience and still doesn't get enough flying. He did the simulator flying. He created simulators. He did YouTube videos on how to make simulators. He did radio controlled airplanes. I spoke with a woman who would spend time with radio control towers, and he would come and help them. She was quite young and help all the kids do it. I mean, he was a nut for flying. But no, and you see a lot of people saying that. But who is actually saying that he was suicidal and willing to end his career in this way? No one. No reliable, no reliable source. One of the articles by William Langewiesche, who I'm sorry to say is now dead, but the article was irresponsible, talks about these unnamed sources who said he was suicidal. Somebody's willing to say that
Yeah.
based on no evidence that I have seen, it's not credible. So if it's not Zahari, if his murder suicide tendencies have been hidden from public view for now, we're looking at 12 years. Okay, so if it's not Zahari, then who? Farik, 27 years old, about to get married, starting off on his career in a highly respected profession in Asia. He's going to be an airline pilot, a captain someday. Really? He's going to kill himself? I mean, where's the evidence of that? So you just can't go there with any shred of credibility that I can see.
Okay.
So I'm sorry I got off on this tangent, but
No,
you
no,
know,
please.
there are no facts there. And there are facts here. There are facts in the world of something went wrong with the airplane. And nobody wants to
Hmm.
talk about them. The fact that you have had so many guests on and they never talked about the rat deployment, that they never talked about the switch off of the fuel tanks. I mean, the oxygen tanks.
Okay, thanks.
That tells me people are looking at where they want to look. We're flooded with. Sorry, okay, I promise this will be my last rant. We watch movies in which, and TV shows in which there's always something, criminal going on in airplanes. Like no plane crashes in a normal way. There are always, bombs or missiles or hijackers. But look, it's fiction. That's not reality. Let's look at reality. And in this case, Malaysia 370, and one more component would be that these pilots were brown and Muslim. I mean, so the rest of the Western world is looking at them as capable of something that white pilots would not be capable of. That's just sort of an underlying racism that's throughout this investigation. And
Wow.
the 737 Maxes as well, because there you had the same problem. You had brown pilots
Hmm.
and
Uh,
they're not as competent as white pilots. That seems to be the underlying message in all of this.
Christine, I really want to ask you again one more time.
Sorry.
So the rat deployment usually happens when the plane loses its electronics and the power. It helps the plane glide, from what I know. Do you have any source that confirms that the rat was deployed? Because as I said, no one has ever mentioned this till date.
Yes, we know that the rat deployed because it would have deployed under the circumstances of the plane running out of fuel. And I would like to actually put a pin in this because my recollection of beyond there is more to it, and there is more to the rat deploying that I just can't put my brain on right now. But we know the plane ran out of fuel,
Hmm.
and then the rat would deploy. That is what happens when the engines run dry.
Yes.
They lose electrical, and that because it's your last chance to get that airplane on the ground. But I wish I could tell you more citations on it. And perhaps if I get back to you after your show, we can put them in the show notes because I think beyond what Christine Negroni is saying, there is more evidence than just the plane ran out of fuel, therefore the rat deployed. There is reason to believe the rat deployed. Oh,
That
I
would
know
be
what,
great.
I know what
Okay,
it
go for it.
was.
Okay, please.
I remember now. We know the rat deployed because the satellite booted up again. So came off. There was no electrical on the airplane because the plane ran out of fuel. And when the rat deployed again, the satellite rebooted. That's the reason. That's the other reason we
Okay,
know.
got it.
But I stand
Now,
by my offer to if I've forgotten something else, I'll let you know, put it in the show notes.
please, definitely we will too. Now, I'm going to put once again the investigative lens back on you. Captain Zahari's simulator, home simulator. We had asked this question to Captain Nick. We've asked this question to Tuanda Ismail. And I'm going to ask you this question again. From an investigative point of view, does it raise any kind of flags without any color being an investigator who's working on MH370?
No. I mean, he was interested in the simulators. He flew lots of simulators. If you're going to say that um, a pilot who likes simulator flying, who spends, hours and hours of his off time doing that, is programming flights into the ocean that is directly to the, if I am correct in my geography, west of him,
Hmm.
Would you say that a simulator pilot who lives in New York City, who flies routes to the ocean directly to the east of him, would you say, well, that means he's planning to bury his plane into that ocean? It looks suspicious to people who live outside of Malaysia, far away from Malaysia. Well, he was flying that airplane into the Indian Ocean. Well, the Indian Ocean was right over there. That was his ocean. So it's not to me unusual. And it's not, whatever number of flights. And I believe when the information first came out, the woman who got that information, whose name I can't think of right now, the French woman who has written her book, was saying number of the number of the of flights that were flown into that area was shown as being very high, but they didn't have the full total. In other words, yeah, he flew what I'm making the numbers up, I don't know, but let's just say
Sure,
he
sure.
flew 1,000 flights into the Indian Ocean. Well, was that 1,000 flights of 100,000 flights? Or was that 1,000 flights out of 1,500? Okay, then maybe it's more interesting that he seemed to be interested in the Indian Ocean, and that's where the plane flew. But it's a fact without any kind of context. And it doesn't mean anything to me. He liked to fly the simulator. He flew the simulator in the geographic area in which he lived.
Hmm.
BFD, I just don't see why that's a big deal. Show me
Well,
why it's a big deal before you conclude that a man with a sterling reputation as pilot went ahead and killed himself and everybody on board the airplane. That connection's never been made that I've seen.
great. Correct me, this online source, it said that you went into a high altitude chamber to experience hypoxia yourself. Is that correct? Because I have a follow-up question on
Yes, I did. I did.
it. Okay, perfect. Okay, just want to make sure. Could you describe that experience and explain the insidiousness of oxygen deprivation, how a pilot might think they're performing math problems correctly while they're losing consciousness?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something. Your viewers should Google high altitude chambers and, what happens to pilots because the videos are fascinating, really fascinating. And it was when I saw them during my research that I said, I have to experience this for myself because it's kind of crazy how and this happened to me, so I'll put it in the first person, but you're in there and you're looking around, and there were lots of other pilot candidates from EVA Airlines with me. They all get hypoxia training at that airline. Not all airlines do it, but EVA does. Kudos to them. We're all sitting around and joking and laughing, and there's somebody standing by with an oxygen mask because once they start ratcheting up the altitude, this person's going to save your life. And it's just like a joke. It's like a big joke. And then they hand out these clipboards, and we're looking at the questions. Write your name, how old are you? Here's some math problems. And then, so then okay, we're going to start. And I'm filling them out and I'm filling them out and I'm thinking 3 plus 3, yeah, that's 6. Nobody's gonna fool me. But of course, I'm doing this and I'm thinking I'm so great. And the next thing I know, I got a mask on my face and somebody's saying, Christine, 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 Christine. I didn't feel it come on. I didn't feel
Wow.
it just from I'm feeling great to I am unconscious. Now that's the physiology changes from person to person. Some people, which this is why I urge your viewers to go take a look at the YouTubes. Some people are talking back. Like, yeah, yeah. They give them cards to play, like, yeah, that's the 6 of spades, that's the 3 of spades, that's the 3 of spades, that's the 3 of spades. They keep seeing the 3 of spades, 25 cards later. So obviously they're still awake, they're still talking, but their brain is locked into a past event. So that's a whole other way of experience hypoxia. And many people describe it as a feeling of euphoria. Remember, it's kind of like, you're not getting enough oxygen to your brain. So it's kind of like being drunk, right? So some people feel it that way. They feel empowered, very strong. Anyway, so it happens differently to different people. And the reason that they do hypoxia training is so that you, as a pilot, military in the United States, they
Hmm.
all pilots get hypoxia training. The reason they get it is because they want you to remember, oh yeah, my fingers and toes started to tingle. That's hypoxia. Hopefully, they still got enough gray matter to make that connection. Yeah, I should have the mask on. So I talk about in the Crash Detectives, I talk about a number of events in which pilots experience hypoxia. Some respond correctly, some respond incorrectly, uh, some wind up dead. Most of them do not, because they did respond correctly. But when you see sort of how it can happen, the insidious way it can happen, in which you think you're fine, in fact, you think you're better than fine. I imagine that Farik was flying that airplane thinking, I got a problem and I'm going to get this airplane down safely and I'm going to be a hero. I'm going to be a hero. Me, 27 years old, brand new on the airplane, I'm going to be a hero because he was operating with a lack of gray matter, no fault of his own,
Hmm.
but
So is
that's
it so is it fair to say that you lean more on hypoxia versus intervention, which a lot
oh,
of
absolutely. There's no evidence
okay.
of human intervention. Absolutely.
Okay, just want to
Absolutely.
make that clear because a
Yes,
lot of
make
us
it
have
very clear.
actually,
I
yeah.
believe that my theory that these pilots or pilot were overcome with hypoxia explains everything else that happened on that airplane. Why? So we talk about these pilots being like idiots, idiots without, it has a negative connotation in English, but imbecilic, not intentionally stupid, but just compromised. What explains the behavior of turning that airplane around, starting to head back to Kuala Lumpur? Okay, that makes sense. You're like, okay, I got a problem. I better just get back to the airplane. I mean, it doesn't make good sense because the first thing a pilot is supposed to do when they experience a hypoxia event, a decompression event, is put the mask on. That's number one. Second, descend. Number two, this pilot didn't do either, but clearly recognized there was an issue because he's heading back to Kuala Lumpur silently and without his mask. He's heading back to Kuala Lumpur, but then veers away from that and heads to another airport, Langkawi, which to me is a pink flag again, because Langkawi is where this young man learned to fly. And
Hmm.
some logic, not good logic, but some logic, he knew that this airport had a very long runway. He's in a fully loaded 777. In other words, he needs a long runway unless he's going to dump fuel because he's coming in heavy. So he heads to Langkawi. Maybe he's thinking, oh, wait a minute. My plane is heavy. I'm full of fuel. I gotta land. I'll go to Langkawi. I know that airport, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so he's headed to Langkawi. Then he turns again and heads off into the ocean. None of it makes sense. It's the action of a pilot who has lost his ability to think clearly. And when have we seen that before? That's the interesting point. It's not like these two guys discovered hypoxia. We have events in which pilots do stupid things. And when they do stupid things and you go back up the chain, you discover they were hypoxic. So when a pilot does something that doesn't make any sense, an experienced pilot, commercial airline pilot, makes something that does something that doesn't make sense, you got to look at hypoxia. You have to.
Okay, perfect. I want to talk about Helios Airways Flight 522. I know you often cite that
Yeah.
as
Yep.
a blueprint for what happened. For our audience, could you explain the rubber jungle and how a plane can continue to fly on autopilot for hours even after everyone on board is incapacitated?
Yes. And this is a good, I'm glad you brought it up because Helios Flight 522 to me is, it's the reason I immediately started looking at hypoxia when I arrived in Kuala Lumpur for ABC News, because I had written extensively in 2006, 2007 about hypoxia and how pilots, experienced pilots, can get on the airplane, start the flight, and do the wrong things unintentionally. This is the perfect case. There are two pilots on this airplane. It's a 737. It's heading off from Crete to, not Crete, Cyprus to Athens. They get on the airplane, everybody buckles up, they take off, and they get to about 10,000 feet or 11,000 feet, and the oxygen masks drop. and they get a warning. The pilots get a
Hmm.
warning when that happens, and that warning is telling them you have a problem with the pressurization of the aircraft. But, and here's the interesting thing, that warning horn at the time served two functions. It told you you had a problem with the pressurization of the aircraft. It also told you you were improperly configured for takeoff. That only matters if you're on the ground. So if you're flying this airplane, you're going down the runway, and you get an improper takeoff configuration warning horn, you don't take off because you're not going to fly. So these guys are in the air. They get the horn. They say, why are we getting an improper takeoff configuration warning horn? Well, that's a stupid, air quotes, question, unless you're not thinking clearly. Now you can be confused. So they're trying to figure out why they have an air takeoff configuration warning horn when they can't even figure out it's a pressurization problem. So then they get on the radio and they're asking these questions. Why are we getting this? Maybe it's the air conditioning fan. And they're trying to diagnose the problem. Neither one of these pilots puts on their oxygen mask. One, the captain gets up, goes behind his seat to the panel and is trying to figure things out on the panel. He collapses on the floor. The first officer collapses over the yoke of the air of his control yoke. He collapses. The airplane is in autopilot mode. It's heading for Athens with or without these pilots. And that's what it does. In the back, all these passengers putting, we assume, putting on their oxygen masks because everybody's told to do that, and they do that. You got 15 minutes of oxygen if you're a passenger. That's all you get. That's why it's important for pilots to do the right thing. After 15 minutes, they are slowly starved of oxygen, so they are just like the guys up front. That's what we call a
Wow.
ghost plane, right? Everybody's unconscious and soon to be dead. But one person, and thank the Lord in heaven that this flight attendant did this, or I don't think we'd know as much as we do. This flight attendant was training to be a pilot, and he thinks, I think we got a depressurization problem. And he goes in, and in the flight attendant storage area, there's oxygen bottles. Each of them lasts 30 minutes. So he takes the oxygen, blah, 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 blah. We don't know what he does on the airplane, but in the last, I think it's 7 minutes, it's in the book. He's on the last oxygen bottle, right? Four bottles, 30 minutes, 2 hours in. His last oxygen bottle, he says, I'm going in. And he opens the door to the cockpit and he sees what's happened. One dead here, or unconscious, whatever. They're out. He gets in the seat of the captain. And we know this because Greek Air Force airplanes are flying on either side of this airplane because it's after 9/11 and they're wondering what an airliner is doing headed without any kind of radio communication to Athens. They're going to, I don't know, shoot it down, whatever. They see this kid get in and they see him put on the mask and they do not hear him, but he is on the radio hitting the wrong button saying, I need help or whatever, Mayday. It's in the book, whatever he said. And he's trying to fly this airplane, but he can't because the engines are running out of fuel. So he hits the mountain and he's the last person. They all died. He's the last person. But this knowledge about somebody trying to save the day, the oxygen bottles, the pilots not doing it, all recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. It's all recorded, it's all knowable. So when I wrote about that story, and there's many safety issues that are consequential or worth noting in this accident. I won't bore you with them, but when I wrote about this and then showed up in Malaysia, and they're saying the same thing, the pilots, they everything's fine. There's no reason to think there's anything amiss, but then they start turning this way, then they start turning this way, then this way, and then nothing, and they're flying perfectly perfectly, other than the turns, which were by pilot control. Other than the turns, when it finally starts heading into the Indian Ocean, there's no more input that tells you a person was in command of this aircraft. So, what does that tell you? It tells you somebody is making insensible decisions until he can no longer make any decisions because he's incapacitated as well. It's exactly the same story.
Wow. Before I ask you other question, I'm going to take you back to the initial conversation. You said you were in Malaysia for the first 6 weeks on the ground when this happened, and you said there were some kind of evidences that were coming out. Would you take a moment to tell us a little bit about what kind of evidences back then were surfacing that maybe said, okay, this supports this narrative, or this is a flag once again in my investigative lens when you were on the ground for the first 6 weeks in Malaysia covering the MH370 for ABC?
Well, oh, sure. The fact that, first of all, the fact that the uh, they were reporting for a period of time that the plane went into the Indian Ocean, went into the South China Sea, and then they were reporting that the plane, this is what was being fed to us, that the plane,
Hmm.
oh, actually, I don't think they said this in an official briefing, but it was reported by several newspapers that the plane ascended to 40,000 feet and and this was all being picked up by, reporters because it was a vacuum of actual facts coming out that there was uh, the fact that this plane ascended, the theory was it ascended because the pilots were trying to knock the hijackers off their feet by doing these maneuvers, that would upset, make them fall down or whatever, and then diving low. I mean, they were treating the airplane like a fighter jet, and that came out. And then the worse, I'd say worse, is that when the prime minister got up and said, well, the transponder, which is the device that allows air traffic controllers to know what the identification of this airplane, its altitude and its flight number and all of that, that transponder was turned off. That's what he said, turned off. And worse, I think he said intentionally turned off. But the fact of the matter is, you don't know intention. There's no way of knowing intention without asking the person why'd you turn it off, and that person's dead. So that's not knowable. It could have turned off, or it could have been switched into standby. There's two different options there. They don't know which it was, but they said turned off. And some of those options are not human oriented. And I will put in parentheses Air India 171 engines turned off. There's no way of knowing whether those engines were turned off. We just know they ceased to function. That's another story for another day. Um, so in any event, so these things were made, and these statements were made, and they sent people down these roads where, well, if they intentionally turned off the transponder, then they must have been doing something wrong. Well, the first fact is not a known fact, so you can't build a bridge on it. That bridge will collapse. If you want facts, that bridge will collapse. If you want theories, you can do what you want. Then there was the theory that this airline pilot had said he was flying in the radar shadow of another airplane so he wouldn't be seen, which is ridiculous on its face because the airplane was about to leave radar airspace. Why would it go back where it couldn't be seen on radar? Because X number of miles out over the ocean, there is no radar. Why would he fly? He was going into a radar-free space. Why would he turn around and go back into a radar-free space if his intention was to avoid radar? That makes no sense. He was about to be over the South China Sea. So many of these theories were like, yeah, if you don't know anything, then you can latch onto them and you can come up with a theory. But the transponder, why it failed, we don't know. The up and down of the airplane, we do know it did not go up and down. And we know that because it wouldn't have flown as far as it did if it had made
Hmm.
those, because it takes a lot of fuel to do what this guy was suggesting. This plane flew like the best kind of fuel efficient automobile you know. It flew to the very last dregs of the tank. So it wasn't doing maneuvers like that. And there's no radar information to suggest that it was. That was something else that was reported. And then the third point of that was we talked about intentionality, radar, and hiding from radar. And the argument about that I already made. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff that was coming out that led people to this theory, but facts just don't support those theories. I'm
Wow.
not opposed to coming up with what happened to that airplane. Show me some facts though before you feed it to me, because I don't buy the facts I've been given.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for sharing these because once again, some of these things are new to our ears in this series, which has never been mentioned before, you know. I have a few more questions before we wrap this up. I want to talk about, so we have spoken with French investigator Jean-Luc Marchand about the satellite handshake at 1825 UTC. While many see this as a manual reboot, you suggest it could be more a symptom of a mechanical failure. Now, how could a problem in the E&E bay, which is the electronics and engineering bay, cause a system to log off and then go back on?
Right. And well, and so interesting that particular log off, which I'm glad that you spoke to someone about it because it's really unappreciated by a lot of people who think they know a lot about Malaysia Airlines, who really don't understand that this problem with the satellite happened twice. The second time we understand because, you know, the plane was running out of fuel. But the first time, we don't understand why the link to the satellite turned off. So there are four explanations for why it might have happened, which I mention in the Crash Detectives and talk about. But the one that matters is this. If the plane loses electronics, the satellite will log off and log back on when the electronics are regained. And somewhere along the line, that airplane did have to gain its electronics because the engines were producing power. And we know they were producing power for the reason I just explained. This plane was flying excellently. So, what caused the electronics to fail on that airplane? So I look back, I do my search to see, well, what other incidents have we had where that has happened? And I come across this Qantas flight that's landing in Bangkok, and it's 15 minutes away from approach to the airport. And all of a sudden, the pilots say, we've lost electrics on the airplane. And that's a problem. And so, they get them back and they land, no problem. But they report that to the Australians who then do an investigation because that's not supposed to happen. And so they do an investigation. In the course of their investigation, they come across five events in which this has happened before. And they also discover that the issue on this particular airplane was that there had been water coming in. I believe it was a 747, but check me in the book. Water from the sink of the kitchen, the flight attendant's kitchen, is directly above the E&E bay. So imagine like the E&E bay is behind the cockpit and it's like a trap door, like in the movies, it's a trap door. And you open the trap door and you go down the stairs. I can send you a picture if you want to post it of me in the E&E bay. And you go down, and then all of a sudden you're like in this little closet and you're surrounded by electrics. It's fascinating, buses and boxes and cabinets. And but that water, the water from this galley is leaking into the E&E bay. And that caused this temporary cessation of electrics to the airplane, and then it recovered, blah, blah, blah. And so the Australians issued a report on this, and they made some recommendations, and blah, blah, blah. Well, I think, well, that's interesting because on the 777, the galley for the business class passengers is directly over the E&E bay. So I think, well, maybe that's a potential, but it's not that common from what I can see. So I reach out to a friend of mine who's a mechanic who works on 777s and other wide body aircraft. And I said, have you ever heard of this before? And he says, oh, yeah, it comes across pretty often. We have to deal with that. And he explains that there are these little tracks, little like gutters that run that's supposed to collect the water and send it safely away. But sometimes they don't work, like the gutters on my house. Sometimes, you see the water coming down by the window and you figure I got to get that fixed. So I'm telling you, days later, my friend sends me a video of this very thing happening. And I said, where did you get this video? Like, is there some sort of database for mechanics where you find videos like this? He says, oh no, we just had a plane come in with this very problem, so I took some video for you. So that tells me it's more common than we thought. And that tells me this is a conceivable mechanism for why this airplane lost mechanics at that time, lost electrics at that time. And if that happened, what else happened on this airplane? Could it, and I don't know, because could it have caused the satellite to go out? And I asked the Australians, are they on the same bus, the same connector? And he said, well, we don't know. We never asked that. The Australians were partially involved in the investigation. They should have found that out. They should have gone back and taken a look. They shouldn't have made me, a book author, suggest something to them and just say, well, I don't know. We don't know. With as many people dead on Malaysia 370, you'd think they'd want to know the answer to that. With the potential for another plane load of people to crash, you'd think they want to know that. And that brings me to, if you don't mind if I just say, because I don't want you to
Please.
run out of time before I tell you this, air accident investigations, the official investigations, are highly focused on what actually happened, what is provable. What can we say we know happened? And if they cannot, they do not investigate what could have happened. So the real, to me, the real dilemma, the real tragedy of Malaysia 370 is that these people died, this airplane is lost, and there's no attempt to find out what could have happened. You don't need to put a rubber stamp on it and say, yes, this is official. But if it could have happened, don't you want to know? Don't you want to go out and see? Maybe we should be inspecting these E&A bays more often. Maybe we should be checking, rethinking how we do oxygen passenger pilot oxygen containers, how they're tested. Maybe we need to remind our pilots to put on that oxygen mask when they're alone in the cockpit at 25,000 feet or above, which is the law in the United States. Maybe we need to fix some things. And none of those fixes, Sid, have been implemented, even if they could have contributed. And that to me is the great break in air safety investigations around the world. That's the great break. And I'm a member of the International Society of Air Safety Investigators. I know these people, and I can't get them to see that.
Wow. Um, okay, Christine, I know you are in discomfort of because of your back, so I have three more questions, and I'll be really quick. I know I don't want to have more discomfort. I want to talk about the wreckage. We had the privilege of having Blaine Gibson on the show, who found the wreckage.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, Now, regarding the wreckage, you have pointed out that the flaperon was found in a stored position. What does that specific piece of physical evidence tells us about whether there was a pilot at the controls during the final moments in the southern Indian Ocean?
Yeah, it tells us less about whether there was a pilot at the controls. I don't think there was a pilot at the controls. I mean, I don't think there was a conscious pilot at the controls. But I think it tells us more about these theories that the pilots were trying. And there was one particular theory by this investigator, Larry Vance, who said the pilot was trying to land the plane intact so that it would sink into the ocean and never be found. And that theory is supposed to buttress the pilot suicide theory. So is it important in the investigation? Only to the extent that it discounts this intentional last minute action by the pilot, because there was no flaperon deployed. There was no attempt to land this airplane. In fact, as I talk about in my book and some subsequent articles I've written on flying lessons, the news information I got after the book was published, there's every reason to believe that this airplane didn't come down and didn't land in the air, that this airplane did not land in the ocean intact, but that it actually came apart in the air because it was coming down so quickly after it lost its motors. It came down so quickly that it blew apart simply by, the speed and force, because airplanes are
So you're
only
saying it did.
certified to
So
go at a
you're
certain
saying that
speed.
it disintegrated. That's what you're saying. It disintegrated in the
In the
in the air.
air,
Wow.
in the air,
Wow.
in the air,
Okay.
which could also make finding it a lot more difficult, right? I mean, would
Yeah.
you rather pick up a broken glass that broke in two pieces, or would you rather pick one up that broke into smithereens? I vote for the two pieces. But I think Malaysia 370, there's evidence to suggest Malaysia 370 is in smithereens. And that's why it's so difficult to find.
Wow. Um, to our audience, Christine's book, The Crash Detectives. We have placed the link of the book for to buy it on Amazon in the description. I have ordered mine yesterday. It's supposed to arrive tomorrow, so I can't wait to read the entire book. But I would highly encourage our audience to definitely purchase the book and give some support and love to Christine here. Okay, Christine, final two questions. I want to talk about the ocean infinity, which has been a grueling
Right.
process for the family since 2014. Third search just currently concluded on March 8th of this year. And once again, nothing was found. The search came up empty. So my thing is, I know you have remained steadfast that the plane is in the southern Indian Ocean. If the wreckage is there, why does it continue to elude our most advanced robotic technology to find a plane?
Well, the ocean, as Ocean Infinity says in its own press release in announcing that it has stopped the search, is vast, vast. When I was a kid, I grew up in Florida. It was a great game that my father would throw quarters into a swimming pool and we would dive down and pick them up. You can find a quarter in a swimming pool. A swimming pool is small, a quarter is big and visible. None of those conditions exist in the Indian Ocean. It is deep, it is vast, and it is opaque. And what we are we're looking for, whether it is in one piece or smithereens, is very, very small. It's hard to get our head wrapped around it. But imagine an ocean, with all that encompasses, and something that is infinitesimal in size in comparison into where it is, hundreds of thousands of miles. It's hard to find and obscured by rocks. And if it is in small pieces, covered by sea sludge or whatever it is that's down there. I don't know my ocean geology, but it's not at all surprising to me, which is why going after the airplane instead of looking on the ground for where real legitimate evidence exists has always been, as far as I'm concerned, a misappropriation of funds and energy. That
Hmm.
the passengers, what the passengers' families are not aviation experts, I grant you that, but I feel they were misled to put all their hopes in finding the airplane. That's an emotional desire, but that is not an intellectual desire. An intellectual desire is to find out what happened to that airplane by using the evidence available. And since that evidence isn't available, the evidence we should be going after is in the mechanics records, the pilot's records, the manufacturing records, all the stuff that exists on an airplane that is not in the ocean. It's not in the ocean. It's in Malaysia. It's in
Wow.
Seattle. It's in the satellite transmissions. You know, airplanes send what they call ACARS transmissions all the
Hmm.
time. All those ACARS transmissions are picked up and collected by the airline and picked up and collected by Boeing. It's the ACARS transmissions are turning out, if I can go back to Air India for just a minute, the ACARS transmissions in Air India are turning out to be very illuminating about what might have happened to that airplane, and it has nothing to do with the pilot's actions. Very much has to do with what's happening on board the airplane. Imagine what you would know if your body were all wired up and a doctor, you know, or some computer in your home was just constantly monitoring that information. I mean, you probably don't want to know, but assuming that's what's happening with these airplanes. The data's there. Nobody's demanding that Boeing release that information. Nobody's demanding that Malaysia release that information. And it could be illuminating. We don't know. And for a lot less money than what they've spent to look in the Indian Ocean. It's a fool's errand. And I've always thought that. It's a
Hmm.
dodge because they can say
Wow.
they did their best and came up with nothing. And as long as the passenger families and the rest of the world accepts that, they've won.
Unbelievable. Uh, Final question for the day for you, Christine. I know you had mentioned about the E&E Bay for aviation industries to kind of do the inspection. Beyond that, what is the one safety protocol or technical change you hope the aviation world adopts to ensure a mystery of this scale remains a thing of the past?
Well, I think soon I have two answers to that. One is for the here and now, simple and cheap. Get pilots trained on hypoxia. whether that means going into a chamber. I know there's issues with that. Some pilots feel it's a threat to their health and they don't want to do it. But get them trained on hypoxia, considering they're living in a world in which they cannot live, they cannot survive if that airplane loses pressurization and they don't quickly descend. Considering the risks to their lives every time they get on an airplane, they should know about hypoxia. And many, many pilots told me during my work on this book, they were going to take a new look at their own, awareness of hypoxia from what I wrote in the book. The Helios 522 ought to be shown to every pilot. Every pilot. They should make a movie about it and show, and I think there is one, and show it to every pilot. That's number one. But the second thing I would say is this. Back when real-time flight monitoring was discussed, when Malaysia 370 first disappeared, I think the technological capacity was not available. But I think in the next 5 or 10 years, and some but technical person could correct me if I'm wrong, it's just too much data, too many airplanes flying, too much data to be collected. But I think in the next few years, real-time flight data monitoring is probably a good idea. The minute that airplane lands successfully, boom, you can delete it, or a week later, delete it, like a security camera. But for the time you want to know who broke into your house, it's good to have. And I think it would tell us a lot more. And there's not, I think, a big enough push for that, probably because it's going to cost money. I do want to, before we go, I do want to say, because, and I don't normally say this, but I know your viewers are people who lost loved ones on Malaysia 370, that the Crash Detectives is available in Chinese. I don't know whether you have to be in China to get it, but it is available in Chinese and a bunch of other languages. It's available in Portuguese, it's available in Czech. It's not available, unfortunately, in Spanish. I wish it was. I think that's the next place it ought to be translated. But it is available in other languages. If they're watching your show, obviously they speak English. But if they'd feel more comfortable reading it in a language uh, in Chinese, then I hope they do, because they'll learn a lot from this, I think, that they won't learn in other books.
And is that available at the same link on Amazon, or is it like a Kindle format? What is the
I think it's
format you have?
book. I mean, I think the Chinese
Okay,
version is an actual physical book, and I think you'd have to order it. I don't know. I wish I could say I don't
okay,
know. They'll figure it
no
out.
problem, no problem. We will do our research before we put
Yeah,
those
right.
links.
If you can find the
Uh,
link, please post it.
Please. Okay. Christine, your ability to weave together the technical details of an aircraft with the fragile reality of the human body in flight is truly remarkable. To our audience, if this conversation moved you, please share it. In a world of fleeting digital noise, our collective attention is the only thing that keeps the search for the truth alive. By listening, you ensure this story and the 239 souls it represents are never truly lost to the deep. Christine Negroni, thank you so much for your tireless journalism, for your time, for the passion you possess, which is so clearly visible today in our conversation, and for sharing your perspective with us all today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it. And I'm going to go back and watch all your other episodes so I don't miss a thing.
Please, thank you so much. It was such a blast. And once again, take care of yourself and thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. Have a good
Bye
afternoon.
bye.
Bye.
You as well. Bye.